Earth's oceans cover 70% of our planet, and they are for far more than just surfing and pirates and old fork collections. Oceans absorb about 23% of human-caused CO2 emissions, which helps mitigate climate change. But this makes seawater more acidic, harming marine life like coral and shellfish. It's like giving the whole ocean a bad case of heartburn, and we don't have ocean-sized antacids to help it out. Since the 1950s, oceans have absorbed 90% of the excess heat from rising emissions. This raises temperatures, contributes to sea level rise, and alters ocean currents, leading to ice loss in polar regions and marine heat waves. All of these changes could devastate coastal communities, which are home to 40% of the global population. By 2050, more than 570 coastal cities could be affected by sea level rise, potentially displacing up to 1 billion people. Our oceans are in trouble, but we can make a difference. Call on world leaders to protect our oceans and coastal communities by creating climate-friendly policies. Because a healthy ocean means a healthy planet for all of us.
Imagine happiness as a scale. For years, young people tipped the scale, reporting higher levels of happiness than older generations. But something has changed. The 2024 World Happiness Report revealed a new trend. Young people are now less happy than older generations. This shift is most dramatic in North America, but Western Europe isn't too far behind. So what's causing this happiness gap? Climate anxiety is a major factor. Young people are worried about inheriting a world in a crisis. The rising cost of living is another culprit. Many young adults struggle to afford basics like housing and food. Social media plays a role too. It can amplify feelings of inadequacy and isolation. The US Surgeon General even compared giving kids access to social media to giving them medicine that is not proven to be safe. But it's not all doom and gloom. Recognizing the problem is the first step to solving it. We need policies that prioritize youth mental health, address climate change, and make necessities more affordable. It's time to tip the scales back, because a happier youth means a brighter future for us all.
I want to see the attitude of people changed towards persons with disabilities. We have the ability, we have the potentials, we have the gifts, and have the talent. We only lack the opportunity and the support. I want to see the attitude of people changed towards persons with disabilities. We have the ability, we have the potentials, we have the gifts, and have the talent. We only lack the opportunity and the support.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Now let us begin the session on the UN Summit of the Future, whose future and who shapes it. Later, the discussion will be moderated by Abena Soreno Yanquera, a media personality and menstrual health advocate. But we will first open the session by having a special conversation featuring Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the president of UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. And for this, we invite the founder and chairman of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, Dr. Dino Patijalal, to host the special conversation. Dr. Dino, you may have the floor.
Thank you, Jenny. And I'm pleased to welcome all the speakers for this important discussion on the UN Summit of the Future. And I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, who will have discussion with me in the next 28 minutes or so. And Professor Jeffrey Sachs is president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and he's also the director of Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. From 2001 till 2018, Professor Sachs served as special advisor to UN Secretary Generals Kofi Annan, and then Ban Ki-moon, and then Antonio Guterres. He was also the director of Earth Institute at Columbia University from 2002 and 2016. And I remember when I served as foreign policy advisor to President Yudhoyono, we had very good relations, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs always gave good advice to us. So it's nice to see you again, Professor.
Thank you.
And throughout the day, a recurrent theme was that the multilateral system is under duress, and many question the multilateralism's capacity to resolve today's problems. In fact, the conflicts in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine and in Gaza have challenged the faith and confidence in multilateralism. And obviously the UN is at the center of multilateralism. And on the 22nd and 23rd of this month, there will be a UN Summit of the Future. So I guess my first question to you is, what is the significance of the UN Summit of the Future, and what is the utility or futility of this exercise? Yeah. And please give us your take on this. Yeah.
First, thank you. Thanks for this wonderful forum, and wonderful to see you. Well, the idea is to make the United Nations function more effectively. This is really the agenda of the Summit of the Future, to make multilateralism work. We should understand multilateralism is always fragile. It's always fragile because we don't have strong global institutions. We have nation states. We're organized by nation states. The United Nations is not a global government. It is a meeting place of 193 nation states. Moreover, the nation states are not all equal in their power, their size, their role in the international system. There are great powers that have tremendous military, nuclear, and other capabilities that dominate war and peace issues, and that very often, especially my own country, the United States, that ignore the United Nations. So we have great powers, including the United States, Russia, China, India. I would say at least as four of the most powerful nations in the world. And the UN system sits alongside a very different system, which is a great power politics system. The UN by itself has no financial resources other than what it garners from the nations. It has no military, of course, other than what comes through UN peacekeeping operations. It has no enforcement mechanisms. So the treaties that are under the UN framework are generally not enforceable other than through the decisions of the signatories to enforce them. We are at a time of obviously very fraught great power confrontation, but of a particular kind, in my opinion, and that is the U.S. is trying to maintain a delusional global hegemony, because I know in my country, the security leaders think the U.S. Still calls the shots in the world, if I could put it that way. But obviously Russia doesn't agree, China doesn't agree, and so forth. So we are in a confrontation that I think comes from a confrontation of mindsets, where the mindset of the U.S. security state is to dominate, the mindset of Russia is to resist, the mindset of China is to say, are you kidding? This is not the world we want. And alongside that are global crises like climate change, poverty, environmental disruptions, food insecurity, major crises. And they need cooperation of the major powers, not confrontation. But instead we have a war between Russia and the United States in Ukraine. And be sure, this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is a war between the United States and Russia. It happens to be taking place in Ukraine. The United States wants to put military bases in Ukraine. Russia says no. That's what this war is about. It's a war of great powers. I think the U.S. is completely wrong in this, and that it provoked this war. But be it that as it may, we have a hot war. And then we have a potential war in East Asia over Taiwan, which again, to my mind, is not an issue for war. But there's a lot of talk about war right now and a lot of tensions. So my own feeling, just to come to your point, I think the Secretary General called for this meeting. I can't speak for him, I'm interpreting. He called for this meeting because he knows the UN has to work more effectively. He is completely aware of the great power politics that takes place outside of the UN, and he wants to bring the true global politics, finance, law inside a true multilateral system. Well, that's my view. This is what we really need. My effort every day in the United States is to say to my own government, the United States government, stop your delusions of hegemony and join a true multilateral system. I think this can happen eventually. I hope it happens peacefully and quickly. But this, to me, is part of the drama. If we put aside the great power politics and ask simply about the functioning of multilateralism, then we need real reform to strengthen the UN. For example, to be able to provide real finance to challenges like climate change in poor countries or lower middle income countries that don't have access to quality finance. We need global taxes, in my view, that are collected globally, not by nation states, but by the UN itself on international shipping, international aviation, global financial transactions, and so forth, that are not given by permission of the United States each year, but are part of a global tax system to address global public goods. So that would greatly strengthen matters. We need reform of the UN institutions in a number of ways so that they're more representative, more powerful. The veto of individual powers of the P5 is diminished by an override of vetoes by supermajorities or other approaches. So these are the topics that are, in my view, at the core of the summit of the future.
At the very least, Professor, what do you need to see achieved at the UN Summit of the Future in order to call it a success?
We need, and we won't get more than this, there will be a statement coming out of it, a global pact for the future, but we will not settle complex institutional issues in a two-day meeting. September 22, 23. But we need a commitment to do so and a roadmap to do so. Just to give you an example, the issue number one, or bucket number one, literally, the first bucket of issues for the Summit of the Future is sustainable development. It's achieving sustainable development. And within that context, finance for sustainable development is understood to be the main factor that is lagging right now. Developing countries cannot get access to the finance they need for the investments that they need, whether it's for climate or ecosystems or education for all or the other objectives of the 17 SDGs. So I expect, I hope at the Summit of the Future, there will be a strong statement that the global financial architecture needs fundamental reform to ensure access, especially of the poorest countries, but of all countries, to the finance that is needed on the quality of terms that is needed. Long-term, low interest rate, at least comparable to what the rich countries get. Now, that will not be analytically or substantively settled in September, but there will be a Finance for Development Summit in 2025, June 30 to July 3 in Madrid. By then, there ought to be specifics. What's going to happen to the regional development banks? What's going to happen to the credit rating agencies? What's going to happen to sustainability analysis carried out by the Bretton Woods institutions? What are the terms that are going to be available to low-income countries? We have time for that by next late June, early July. And what I would like the Summit of the Future to do is to make clear the path is from this commitment to the outcomes next Finance for Development to get this done.
The 2024 Sustainable Development Report revealed that only 16% of SDGs are on track to be achieved by 2030. And, if you go to Southeast Asia, you go to South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, SDGs are big, right? In fact, we have a doctrine, ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, where one of the four main priorities is achieving SDGs. But there's talk in the global south that the West, including the United States, has really little interest in SDGs, as reflected in the rhetorics of policy statements of its leaders, rarely mentioning about SDGs. Is that right? Is that accurate or inaccurate? Yeah.
It's not only accurate, it's shockingly so in the following sense. Every country is supposed to put forward its SDG plans to the high-level political forum. These, of course, are called the Voluntary National Reviews, or VNRs. Of the 193 UN member states, 188 have presented VNRs, some countries several times. 5 countries have not presented VNRs. Those are Haiti, Myanmar, South Sudan, Yemen, and, drumroll, the United States of America. So the US has never presented a voluntary national review, because if I were to ask a US senior official, well, what is the SDG plan? They would say, what's SDG? They don't know. There's no attention in my country at the national level to this. But that's the mindset of the US. Unilateral, arrogant, hubristic, not understanding what's going on in the rest of the world, and engaged in war. Okay, it's very important for everyone to understand, though, this is not a reason for neglecting the SDGs or being cynical about the SDGs. This is an occasion for being a little sad about the United States of America, that's for sure, which has really dropped the ball. First of all, for its own citizens, by the way, because we have so many problems internally. But it's not a reason for the rest of the world to be cynical. It is, in my view, partly an explanation why the SDGs are way behind, because one country that's very important in this system doesn't even know about them, doesn't care about them, doesn't focus on them, doesn't provide policies around them, doesn't do it at home. But it's also a reason to say, look, the rest of the world, we're on the right track, because sustainable development, it's not a nice thing, it's not a slogan, it's not a photo op, it's actually vital to combine economic development with social justice, with environmental sustainability, with peace and cooperation. Now, we want to get the US on board. I don't know how many years it's going to take. I keep trying. We'll keep trying. But we're at least at 188 out of 193. I travel the world nonstop, as you know, and wherever I go, governments are committed to the SDGs. They don't have the finance they need. They watch the sanctions regimes, the wars, the priorities of the US dominate, but they are committed to the SDGs. So I want the SDGs to work because they're urgent, not just because we said so, but because they're urgent. And I think that we need to use the Summit of the Future and other forums. The BRICS, for example, extremely important. All of the BRICS committed to the SDGs. We need to use the COP processes in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, in the Convention to Combat Desertification, to promote the SDGs. We really need finance for development to work. We need to fix the IMF, the World Bank, the regional development banks. My message is, don't give up hope, because actually there is so much more consensus on these points than disagreement. It's annoying to me, to put it mildly, that the US is not part of this, but the US is 4.1% of the world population. We've got 95.9% of the world population that we can deal with. And I think eventually the United States will come around. You know, there's a famous saying of Winston Churchill, which is that the United States always does the right thing after it's tried everything else. And I think that this is sometimes a pretty accurate depiction.
Having said that, I think there's a thinking in a large part of the world. Look, if the United States is not ready, we move on anyways, right? And my question to you, in the efforts to revive North-South dialogue and cooperation, which has been going on, the efforts of which have been going on for decades, in such an effort today, is it more reasonable to count on the role of the middle powers of the North and the South? You know, the Brazils, the Indonesias, Turkeys, and the North of Germany and Canada and so on, where cooperation seems to be easier done. So is that the way forward, to rely on these drivers in the North and South, the middle powers in North and South, as champions of North-South dialogue?
My feeling is, first, every region needs to get its act together as a region. So I'm a very big fan of ASEAN acting as a region, because ASEAN shares problems, it shares rivers, it shares ecosystems, it shares rainforests, it shares fisheries, it shares the Indian Ocean, it shares security issues, and so on. And I would like the regional focus. Second, and when it comes to Africa, I'm a very strong proponent of a very strong African Union, because the colonial powers left Africa as 55 independent countries. But if you view Africa as a unity, it's got 1.4 billion people, the same size as China, the same size as India, and I think the same growth prospects as well for very rapid growth in the decades ahead. So I would like to see each region work on long-term sustainable development strategies. ASEAN in 2050. Africa talks about 2063 because of the history of African unity and so forth. But long-term regional strategies, including investments in transport networks, fast rail, 5G, zero carbon power, and so on. Second, I'd like the regions to work together. By the way, in Asia, I would like Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea, and China not to be on opposite sides of a Cold War, but actually integrated together. Because if you put China, Korea, Japan constructively together, oh my God, the results of that for the three and for the rest of the world would be absolutely phenomenal. I'm a very big believer in integration between China and ASEAN, I have to say, because China is by far the world's largest industrial nation, twice the size of the United States in the industrial sector, very cutting edge on transport, power, digital, and it would be phenomenal to have a good integrated advanced 21st century green and digital network connecting China with ASEAN. I like RCEP, which is actually China, Japan, Korea, ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand. I want to put aside the Cold War rhetoric and politics and actually have an integrated, peaceful region, because this would be completely phenomenal. Now, this raises the questions of the so-called North, which basically has three parts to it. There's the United States, there's Europe, and there are the US allies in East Asia. I've already spoken about the US allies in East Asia and the Pacific. I want them to be much less anti-China and much more regional cooperation. When it comes to the United States, we need a new mindset in the United States. Drop the idea of global hegemony, get on with the idea of global cooperation. It will come eventually, because that's the reality, but it's not there yet. When it comes to Europe, there's a huge confusion because Europe has two aspects. One aspect is the European Union. Great, I love it. The European Green Deal and all the rest. But the second aspect of Europe is NATO. And NATO is a US-dominated security system. Europe has this, it can't decide what it is. Is it a peaceful union of countries, or is it an appendage of the US hegemonic aspirations? Europe has gotten itself into a complete mess by supporting the war in Ukraine the way that it has. Instead of going for peace, it has said, we're going to expand NATO. And that is not going to happen, by the way. So when it comes to discussions with Europe, I'm not keen on Europe as being simply a piece of the US security system. I would like Europe to have its own independence. When it comes to economics, there is the prospect of good dialogue, say, between ASEAN and the EU over the future of sustainable development. That's possible, but not if you hear from the Europeans, you must abide by the sanctions against Russia, you must cut off trade, you must understand that this is anti-China. That would kill the dialogue. So I don't believe in a North-South dialogue, period, in this way anymore. The world is multipolar, it has moved on, but Europe needs to get clarity that it's on its best when it's on the peaceful mission of sustainable development, and it is on its worst when it is repeating US tropes that are anti-Russia and anti-China. And this, I think, is part of the drama right now of our global discussions.
Yeah. Professor Seth, I totally agree with you that I would love to see China, Japan, and Korea, working better together. And I think even a bigger deal is US and China working together. Can you imagine the enormous powers of these two countries being the largest economies, their technology and their soft power and so on. And obviously this has not gone well if you see their relationship in terms of COVID-19, for example, and on climate change and so on. They have not worked well together. Can you explain to us as an American, and this is a question that many in the Global South ask, okay, we understand that U.S.-Russia relations is permanently damaged, but what about U.S.-China? Why can't these two guys find some kind of normalized relationship and maybe even strategic mutual accommodation and work together and show themselves as examples to the rest of the world? Because that's one of the big keys to having healthy multilateralism.
This is the great crucial question. First, let me say I do not believe that U.S.-Russia relations are permanently damaged. And I always like to quote President John F. Kennedy, who famously said there are no permanent enemies. He said, hostility today is a fact, but it is not a governing law. And this is really true. And he understood that. Even from the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, the next year, he reached an agreement with Nikita Khrushchev on the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty because he wanted peace. And so I don't want to say that anything is permanently damaged. I make the argument, I'm going to make it in a discussion with my friend John Mearsheimer at a conference in LA on Monday, Tuesday, that there is no reason at all for hostile relations between the US and China. China is not a threat at all to the United States, in my opinion. I don't think Russia's a threat to the United States. If we don't provoke, there's no threat. I think the great powers can live together peacefully, even without the sense of fear, if they don't provoke each other in their own neighborhoods. So I really don't want Russia or China setting up a military base in Mexico, but I tell the United States, just calm down. Don't set up military bases in Ukraine, and don't go to war over Taiwan. That's not your neighborhood, and you don't need to provoke other regions of the world. So that, to my mind, is the most important point. China is viewed as an enemy, though, by the US security state for one overwhelming reason. It's large and it's successful. That causes resentment and anxiety because in this US idea, I'm sorry to say it, they really believed in 1992, well, we're the sole superpower. We are the biggest colossus in history. We can do what we want. This is the so-called neoconservatives. They believed it. It's crazy. If you travel the world, it's crazy. No country can say to the rest of the world, we're the leader, we do what we want. But in Washington, where they don't travel, I don't even know if they have passports, they actually believe this thing. So this is, to my mind, the biggest mindset change that's needed in the US. There's high anxiety about China, to my mind, completely unjustified. And when I say, though, come on, China's not a threat at all, people look at me like I'm crazy. But I go to China several times a year with so many students, former students, friends, colleagues, and so on. And I just don't accept the US mindset that there are deep threat reasons. I also don't think China's a threat to its neighborhood. Let me be clear. China's actions in the South China Sea, to my mind, are not about who owns that particular island. They're about don't block our sea lanes. We need oil. We import food. We know that the U.S. views these as choke points. We don't want the Straits of Malacca to be a choke point. We don't want the South China Sea to be dominated by U.S. submarines. This is the real point. These are security issues. This isn't attempts to dominate. These are security issues. And if both powers would back off each other, things could calm down tremendously.
Yes, well, maybe one last question, and we only have 1 minute for you to answer this. But in the event that President Trump wins again in November, the theme "Make America Great Once Again" will be predominant, right? And my worry is that, look, if America thinks that way under Trump presidency, many countries around the world will think the same. It's all about me too, right? And this is terrible for multilateralism, right? Because that's not what multilateralism is all about. It's all about us, right? Rather than it's all about me, right? I don't know if you have any quick comments on
I
that.
do. If Trump wins, you should worry. If Harris wins, you should worry. I'm worried, period, because the problem is not which political party in the United States or even which candidate. The party is a U.S. mindset that has gone from Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. All five of the last presidents have been on this unipolar idea. This is the thing that needs to change. And by the way, if the rest of the world is clear, calm, nice, but persistent, we want multilateralism, we want the UN, we don't want wars, we don't want great power clashes, we don't want to be part of your alliance, we don't want to be part of their alliance, we want to be independent, peaceful, and multilateral. This message is extremely important because it will get through.
Well, thank you. You always give candid answers and much food for thought, so I really appreciate it. And this is what the Global Town Hall about, an open and deep dive, honest, candid discussions by the grassroots, for the grassroots. So thank you very much
Phenomenal.
for your
Great
time.
to be with everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And
Bye-bye.
now, thank you so much. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Abina, the next moderator, who will go even deeper with our friends from other parts of the world, north, south, east, and west. Go ahead, Abina. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Dino, for such an enlightening conversation. And now we're diving deeper into the UN Summit of the Future, whose future and who shapes it. So this session will provide an overview of the lessons that have already been learned, key actors, key challenges, and what still needs to be done. The choices the world makes or fails to make today could result in further breakdown or a breakthrough to a greener, better, and safer future. Now, finally, how the holding of this summit signifies at the same time a symptom of the problems afflicting the multilateralism and a glimpse of the possible solutions. But do not forget that on your screen, you should have a QR code that says you should scan. This is to Global Citizen. Now, Global Citizen is urging all of you watching Do I still have the floor? All right, I think I assume we'll just go ahead. So yes, as I was mentioning, the Global Citizen, there is a Scan Me code over there that will lead you to learn about systematic causes of extreme poverty, would help you to, take some actions on the pressing issues and end rewards that can be redeemed for tickets like the Global Citizen concert that is coming up shortly, and events and experiences all over the world. So we're about to kickstart this particular conversations as we're discussing the UN Summit of the Future. In actual sense, whose future is it and who actually shapes it? Joining me for this conversation, we do have Felipe Polia. Are you here? The Assistant Secretary General for Youth Affairs. Felipe, could you show me by hand if you're here?
Hello, Abina. Very happy to be here.
We also have Rich Wilson, the CEO of Iceway Foundation and Global Citizens Assembly. We have Abi Finkanua, the U.S. Special Envoy for Global Youth Issues. And last but definitely not least, Hila Yoon, founder of the Afghan Youth Ambassadors for Peace Organization, the 2020 Global Young Leader for the SDG. So right, we're getting straight into it. And the very first question is going to Felipe. Now, Felipe, in your opinion, are there any successes or failures in youth engagement and advocacy that could be adapted as well as applied for the UN Summit of the future? And are there any lessons to be learned from, projects you have seen or projects you've been a part of that could be pivotal in making a difference?
So, very first, thank you, Abina, for your question, for your moderation, and thank you to the foreign policy community of Indonesia and Global Citizen for convening us today. And I know that there's people from everywhere, so it's good night, good afternoon, good morning, depending where we are from. So I will try to focus a little bit on the summit of the future, because I believe this that is happening in September, that is not only about that 2 days where world leaders would gather here in the United Nations headquarters in New York, but it's about the whole process upcoming into this summit and the process that it's starting the 23 of September, when it's about how to make these commitments into action. So as the previous panelists were reflecting, and it was a pleasure also to hear professor's dissertation, the world is facing very complex and interconnected challenges. So I strongly believe, and I think that everyone in this room strongly believes, that more than ever, we need a strong global community that works together in the pursuit of this common good. And that's what it's the United Nations about. The United Nations is the only platform where 193 governments convene, are together. And that's the power of the United Nations, the convening power. We already have a clear vision of the future we want, which is currently off track. These are the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. And we also have very clear principles for how we work together as multilateralists, which is the UN Charter. But at the same time, we know and it's very clear that multilateral structures have many challenges. And some of these challenges are before these structures were established decades ago, when the world was a very different place. So in this context, the Summit of the Future, that is something proposed and put on the table with the leadership of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has a very simple phrase that for me is very symbolic. That it's that we're not going to be able to deliver and to solve the issues that are affecting our grandchildren or will be affecting our grandchildren with a system that was designed to solve the issues of our grandparents. And that's the Summit of the Future, what it's about. And in this summit, there's a specific Pact for the Future, a specific intergovernmental negotiation around special transformations. And there's an opportunity there when it's about the meaningful engagement of young people in the decision-making. And this is a very structural and important issue, not only for the UN, but for every institution in the world. Half of the world's population is under 30 years old. This is the most educated and the largest generation ever of young people. So it's about institutions to decide how we want to really engage with young people. And young people want to engage, and they're showing us on their leadership, advancing on the climate issue and by advancing on mental health issues, that they want to be part. So that's the Summit of the Future, and that's the opportunity we have ahead.
All right, thank you so much, Felipe. Now I would move to Abi Finkenua. Now, in your opinion, are there any successes or failures in youth engagement and advocacy that could be adopted and applied for the UN Summit of the Future? And also, are there any lessons to be learned from the project that you have seen or been a part of?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Abina, thank you, Global Citizen, and love getting to join anything with Assistant Secretary General of Youth, Felipe Collier. Always good to see you. Good to see everyone on here. So yes, there's a lot that I have actually learned recently in the last couple of years since I've been in this role as U.S. Special Envoy for Global Youth. I was actually appointed by President Biden in November 2022 to lead U.S. government efforts in engaging young people, both domestically on foreign policy issues, but also obviously internationally. And I actually happen to be the first special envoy for this space, which I think says a lot about the emphasis that Secretary Blinken and President Biden have put on the outreach to young people. And quite frankly, there's always more to do. And when it comes to what we can continue to do more of and things that I think over the years has gotten a little bit better, but we can, again, keep working on, really means which young people are at the table, right? It can't just be the young people who are the ones who are the top model UN students, right? We have to do even a better job of reaching out to young people who may not even know this system exists. That's something, again, that I'm incredibly passionate about as somebody who literally grew up in a town with more cows than people in the middle of the US, who's first generation college. I didn't know any of these systems growing up. I had no clue, right, about just the importance of how these international organizations work. And one of the things that we've really focused on within my role is actually even working with the US UN Youth Observer, talking to young people in the US about the SDGs, along with all of our incredible youth programs we have around the globe and incorporating that into it. So I do take a little bit of I would say I disagree quite a bit with some of the things Professor Sachs said earlier, and I just wanted to address that this is an important piece of what we do. It's why my office exists. It's why we're going to continue to do this work. And one of the bigger pieces I've also learned, including with an event that we did with the Assistant Secretary General of Youth, was that when we're talking about incorporating young people into the Summit of the Future, or just in any international organization space, it's so important to not just have these youth councils. Youth councils are great, but it's important that it's not just 10 young people sitting around talking to other 10 young people. The reality is these 10 young people that might be part of a youth council are actually experts in various different topics, and again, need to not just be put together and check a box and say we've done it, but actually be incorporated into those larger discussions. Again, my office is global youth issues. Every issue is a global youth issue, and young people deserve a seat at the table in all of those high-level meetings. And so that's something that we're going to continue to advocate for. I know it's something that, again, Felipe has been working on as well, and we're happy to champion his work in that space, because it's so vitally important that young people, again, aren't just seen as young, but also experts in various topics, and again, not just talking to each other.
Beautifully said. I think a lot of people also do agree that it's not only about you having young people just observing what is happening, but they also having a seat at the table to contribute meaningfully. Now I'm going to move on to Rich Wilson. The Global Citizens Assembly is an initiative that you are launching during the UN Summit of the Future. Congratulations, by the way, with hopes of supporting the successful outcomes of the summit. How might the Global Citizens Assembly aid in reconfiguring the version of the United Nations that the international community is in need of in order to address key concerns facing the summit, such as, the increased need for international cooperation?
Yeah, thanks, Sabina, and really great to hear Jeffrey, Felipe's, and Abby's perspective. Look, this challenge of governance reform exists everywhere around the world right now, right? This is not just a global problem, it's a local, national problem. We're all facing this crisis. How do we get government systems which were built often 100 or hundreds of years ago to be able to cope with today's challenges? And one of the things you might have noticed is that communities around the world, this is why this event is so important, a lot of the really interesting innovations that are happening right now are not happening within the system. Well, there are great things happening within the system. I work personally very closely with lots of major governments, but it's actually grassroots citizens organizing things themselves to try and see how can we meet the crisis we're facing. One of the really big innovations in government reform is citizens' assemblies, and they're happening across the world. And for those of you who don't know, citizen assemblies are the new political chambers where people are selected by lottery, just like jury service, but then they are representative of the population in question. So whether it's young people or old people or based on the ethnicities, it's a direct reflection of the population in question. And we've been doing this now for like 20, 30 years, and we now have very, very good evidence that citizens' assemblies deliver better policies than politicians. They generate solidarity, they accelerate action on the big issues that we face, but they haven't had the scale or impact that we really, really need. Now, this is the reason why the SG and many other people in the multilateral system are looking at the Global Citizens Assembly as a way of creating a new kind of multilateralism that might be able to deliver on those objectives. And so we ran the first Global Citizens Assembly for COP26 in 2021, and it consists of three components: a core assembly, which is demographically representative of the core of the global population, community assemblies that anyone can run anywhere. And the reason why this is such an important call for us today is when we launch this on the 23rd of September, we're going to need people around the world to be able to run community assemblies. And we have a target of 10 million people participating in COP30. It's a huge undertaking supported by the Brazilian government and lots of other major member states, IPCC, OECD, and other critical organizations, as well as grassroots organizations, but also a campaign, and we'll hopefully work with Global Citizen on that to really boost that level of participation. Now, one of the key questions people always ask is like, but how do they have impact? Well, if you look at the French Assembly, the Irish Assembly, the Armenian Assembly, they've had extraordinary impact on accelerated climate action, getting traction on issues like abortion, tough issues. And one of the ways they've done this, they've built coalitions of organizations inside and outside of formal governments to take forward actions, even if there are institutions, let's say, as Jeffrey described, say, the state blocking on SGs, to enable action to take place through alliances of the willing. So please check out our website, Global Citizens Assembly coalition.org, and see how you can join the coalition or run an assembly.
All right, thank you so much, Rich. And we cannot wait to see how the Global Citizens Assembly turns out. Now, Hila, now you are the African Youth Ambassador for Peace. What are some key lessons young people can learn from your peace-building journey? And how can we meaningfully involve youth in conflict zones in these efforts? And how can platforms like the UN Summit of the Future be leveraged for sustainable and long-term change?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I think as I work at the grassroots level, our organization been active in Afghanistan for almost 5 years. We work with tribal leaders, religious leaders, and young people at the grassroots level. And I come from a grassroots level as well. Both my parents are survivors of civil war in Afghanistan, and same as me, have survived many terrorist attack in Afghanistan. And when we started this organization, when we talked about peace building, the first thing I learned about international community related to peace was UN Resolution 1325 and 2250 about how to involve young people in peace building dialogues, and how can we involve young people who are in conflict zone in meaningful engagement at the international level. So working in this platform for almost 5 years, I think one of the lessons I've kept learning, and this is something I've been advocating as well for almost 5 years now, is that the word grassroots is a buzzword now that we're using at the international level, but what does it mean supporting grassroots organization at the local level? In Afghanistan, in countries like Afghanistan, we have so many people and so many international organizations working and saying that we are supporting young people, but what does it look like in reality? This year we had a online panel, and one of our members, he had to walk 2 hours from one village to another village just to go to a mosque and find electricity and connect online. So when we look at these things and these young people on the ground suffering all the time, and then we look at the international platforms and that they keep saying it, that we need to bring young people and grassroots voices to the international platform. Is it a reality? Is it really happening or not? And one of the biggest gap is that we're still not bringing the grassroots voices from the ground at these international platforms. First, because the language barrier is a big thing, and the UN and international organizations are still focusing on this, and they're still not tackling this issue right enough. The second is the visa restriction. Countries which, Western countries that hold high morals and thinking that they are implementing SDGs, they're not even providing the right logistic to young people who are in conflict zone, who cannot even access to visa. Now in Afghanistan, it's been more than 3 years that access to education is completely banned towards women. And in this country, a lot of these women are getting scholarship, and these are also young people who want to go abroad and study. But the same countries who are holding these high morals and focusing on implementing SDGs are denying visas for these young people. So what are we still missing out? The missing out part of how we cannot still not meaningfully involving young people as much as we can is we lack accountability and implementation. And these are the two things that we should focus on when it comes to meaningful engagement of young people. We have so many resolutions at the UN. We have so many policy papers at the UN right now. Any international platform, regional organization, they keep publishing new articles, new policies, new resolution. But what is still lacking is accountability and implementation of these resolution and these policy papers. Unless we have collective approach to solve these problems, you will never engage young people at the international level meaningfully. So accountability and implementations is the key, but also avoiding selective activism when it comes to how we're involving young people in meaningful decision. If you're from a certain countries, you're involved in youth participation at these international platforms because you have passport privilege, you have all the privilege of that thing you can have and attend these things. But if you're coming from a conflict zone, young people are not even, they don't even entertain the idea of coming to New York and attending these summits. So it's really important to highlight these realities on the ground and focus on this. And this is something a lot of people are, and from conflict zone especially, are advocating for a long time. And this is what we need: collective approach to solving these problems and avoiding selective activism and selective approach when it comes to meaningful engagement of young people at the international platforms.
Well, thank you, Hila, for such an eye-opening submission. I'm sure everyone listening in has felt it one way or the other. And it's all about, at the end of the day, how are we finding opportunities and ways to be able to scale the work that, these activists are doing on the ground. It's not just about we hearing that grassroots are doing it, but how are we also stepping in to be collectively involved and knowing that at the end of the day, we are finding solutions. Thank you so much. Now we're about to transition to, our discussant. We do have Professor Jagannath Panda with us. We also have Mr. Mushir Abdul Hamid Al-Sharabi, as well as Dr. Michael Yusa and Nados Berry here. We're going to start with Professor Jagannath Panda. Professor, your response, and then right from that, you proceed to your question.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in the Global Town Hall, and I enjoyed the panel and different viewpoints here. 3 brief comments. I think initially we talked about the summit of the future. Now, on a critical note, yes, there are many problematic areas. There are many crises are happening: a global climate crisis to humanitarian crisis to war. Shall we call it a summit of future, or should we call it summit of current? Because most of the root of these problems are linked with the past politics and the current problems. So I think we need to live with the current in order to envision for a future. So therefore, any global dialogue, any global problem solving, decision making process has to start from the ground level, from the current, and having its roots from the past. What has been the problem? The problem has been superpower politics. Problem has been clash of national interest. Problem has been lack of coordination. And therefore, the problem and the solving point has to be found both in the current and as well as in the past. Second, I think it is one thing to say that there are problem areas, and each of these major powers, be it China, be it US, they are talking about unipolar dimension of the world. And I think Professor Jeffrey Search had a point there, but I don't necessarily agree with him. I think certain countries are becoming threat, certain countries are becoming concerns to the rest of the world. And there we need to have a much more effective coordination to resist some countries from becoming threat from the concern. For example, today China is a severe concern on many areas. China is not definitely concerned or a threat in all areas, but China is definitely concerned in many areas. And I think our challenge is to differentiate those areas, identify those areas, and single it out in order to coordinate effectively globally to resist China not to become a threat. Similarly, it goes to the US. Similarly, it goes to many other developed countries. I think we need to find out what has been the concern and what is going to be the threat. We cannot generalize by saying that a particular A, B, C country are not threat. They are definitely posing a threat. Look at the climate crisis in the Tibet. Look at the climate crisis in Himalaya regions. These are
Professor
not
Jagannath,
really...
we are running out of time. Could you kindly head straight to the question so we proceed?
Yes, I think the root of the problem is lies in the decision-making process. My last point is, I think I'll go with the last presenter. We need effective collaborations at the youth level, be it at the global south level or at the north-south level. We need a effective participation of youth who will build the future. Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. Now we move on to Mr. Mushir Abdul Hamid. You do have 3 minutes. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mushir Sharabi from Yemen, the managerial director of Arab.
You've muted yourself, so if you could unmute yourself, we'll be good to go.
No, it's okay. All right.
Yes, it's
okay. Hello, everyone. I am Mushir Sharabi from Yemen, the managerial director of Arab Youth Sustainable Development Network. It's my honor today to participate and to be with you in this important discussion about the UN Summit of the Future. As we approach the vital summit, which will be held in New York in September this year, it's important to recognize that the voice of youth are not just important, they are vital. Young people, especially from the global youth, from the global south, represent the significance of the future. The UN Summit of the Future presents a unique opportunity to change that narrative. In my country, Yemen, where I led AYSDN, we face challenges, several challenges, including the urgent impact of climate change and the need of sustainable development goals. Our network is dedicated to empowering youth by raising awareness about climate change and advocating them for inclusive decision-making process. We believe that young people must be at the front line of discussion that shape our future, not just to participate as the, not just to be like participants, but they have to be like as leaders. But the question that is keep in my mind is, will this summit be like helpful to countries like Yemen? Will it have a tangible impact on the work we are doing in youth involvement, peace, development, and human rights? In my view, this summit can be useful, but only if it succeeds high-level discussion and results in real steps. Like Yemen is a unique in a unique position. It's a country which destroyed by conflict, but it's a home to a bright youth society eager to change. We need a process that directly support youth-led initiatives, not just in terms of empty talk, but in real, with real resource and international cooperation. For example, in the network that I'm working at, we are raising awareness about climate change and sustainable development goals among Arab youth, but we often face significant barriers, lack of funding, and limited access to global platforms. While the UN Summit of the Future promised to address global challenges, I'm concerned that it might not be structured in a way that deliver immediate benefits to a country like Yemen. What we need from this summit, we need like a clear mechanism that convey resource and attention to the most vulnerable countries like Yemen. Yemen youth needs access to funding, education, and platforms that amplify their
Mr.
voice.
Mushir, we're running out of time, but could you just outline what the question is so we are able to throw back to...
My question is this summit will address that challenge that the remote countries facing, like my country. And I
Okay.
just would like to make this summit as turning point for countries like Yemen to invest in youth, invest also in sustainable development goals. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. Now we'll turn to Dr. Michael Yuash, who's the Senior Manager of the Global Analysis Program at the Global Center for Pluralism. The floor is yours.
Thank you all. Thank you, Abina, the panelists, and all involved in bringing this together. I will endeavor to keep this within the 3 minutes. And so just as a react to what I heard from the panelists, I think a wonderful common thread from Philippe, who identified about what the type of diversity of voices within the youth bring to the system and the importance of that to the issues. Abby picked up on the fact that you actually really need to see the effort to reach out to the youth as one of penetrating and going beyond those that are just convened at simple technical levels or in technical forums and really getting to those populations. Rich, your discussion about citizen assemblies really highlights the fact that you need to bring in, even if it's on a random basis of selection like jury selection, a diverse array of voices into these conversations. And Hila, you really got to it when you said the grassroots is a buzzword. You need to really get to the grassroots. At the Global Center for Pluralism, we understand and recognize that diversity is a feature within every society, and we understand pluralism to be an ethic of positively responding to diversity. To better understand pluralism, we developed the Global Pluralism Monitor. It's an expert evaluation tool that assesses drivers and impediments to pluralism in a society. In applying the tool, expert assessment team members select actually diversity types or peoples or groups within a society to render visible their experiences across a range of 20 indicators. It surfaces the diverging and shared experiences across groups within a society, and that's essential to telling the story of pluralism in a country. I'm sharing this with you because one of the core learnings of the monitor is that it can be very easy to flatten identity across a society to avoid the added complexity that diversity adds to complicated societal issues and challenges. The youth themselves are not homogenous, and even if we go beyond youth, these societies are not homogenous in any way. And that shortcut can be dangerous. When those shortcuts are taken, there tends to be a perpetuation or worsening of major problems facing a society. With that in mind, what I'd like to ask you is, in preparation for the Summit of the Future, 5 regional forums on the SDGs took place, following efforts by UN resident coordinators to raise awareness about the summit within their countries. Civil society and stakeholder consultations took place too. These are laudable efforts to bring the diverse voices from within countries into the summit process. I would like to ask you all if you think these efforts can meet or have met the threshold of accounting for the diversity of people's experiences within the societies implicated in the summit's issues areas. If so, what enabled that achievement? If not, how can that gap in knowledge be filled to better understand country level dynamics and then more robustly identify and overcome impediments to realizing global progress? Thank you. I think you're on mute.
So we would take the very final one from Nados Barihi, who's the Global Network Project Lead at SDSN Youth. Nados, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Abina, and thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here, and the discussions have been insightful. So mine is more of a remark than a question. I second the panelists' remark on how the Summit of the Future will be key for the youth. And here also at SDSN Youth, we see youth as one of the key stakeholders in the lead up to the summit. And as you know, and you've been introduced to, SDSN Youth is one of the initiatives of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is led by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. And we are a global network empowering youth people to create sustainable solutions and make a real difference in the world. And since our launch in 2015, we've been dedicated to elevating the critical role of youth in driving sustainable development. And we are convinced that the young people hold a key to achieving the SDGs, and we're providing them with the right tools, expertise, and resources needed to succeed. And through our collective efforts over the years, we're working towards a future where young people are equipped to tackle the world's most pressing challenges. And in order to get there, we are empowering the youth to be not just the leaders of tomorrow, but also the change makers of today. And we're building partnerships, creating awareness, advocating, providing capacity building training them and fostering innovation and supporting the projects that are making a real difference in their communities. And drawing from these experiences, we do see the Summit of the Future as an exciting opportunity for authentic youth engagement, and we're eager to play our part in driving this meaningful change. So if you also see youth as the center of sustainability, please do reach out to us at Citizen Youth Anywhere, and we look forward to contributing our perspective in these vital discussions, shape global policies on pressing issues so that the youth voice are not only heard, but also valued and taken into account. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Now, back to our panelists. There have been so many questions that have been thrown, but I think to just give us, a refresh of whatever is happening is that the Summit of the Future is key. We all can tell that it is key. I think Professor Jagannath was saying that we've heard about the times without number, that this is a future of the summit, but are we not supposed to focus more on the now than the future? Because there's a lot happening to us now that we're not able to find solutions to. How about we looking about what is happening in the next 10 years? So the floor is open. I think I will start with Philippe. Are you ready to take the floor? Excited.
I'm ready, Avina, and I think I have 1 minute, so I will be very short. But I will also want to be optimistic, because I think that when it's about youth engagement, it's very important to recognize also that we had made progress. In the last 10, 15 years, the UN, but also governments, institutions have advanced in this idea of how to create more spaces for a more meaningful engagement of young people. Are we where we need to be? Of course not. And I think there's a clear gap between grassroots and global discussions. And usually the young people that have access to global platforms are the usual suspects, are the ones that really know. And that's not because of their fault. That's because of institutions failing in how to create. There are many barriers to really tackle. I keep optimistic in terms of this Summit of the Future as an opportunity for governments to commit to break those barriers. And our United Nations Youth Office, we are an example of the advancement of this agenda. This office was established with the support and the commitment, the political commitment of governments. And this was recently established by the General Assembly. So we want to be a vehicle to also support governments to tackle these gaps, to tackle these barriers. And I tend to be positive because I think that governments want to advance on that direction. Of course, there are exceptions, but most of them really want, because they need to do that, because institutions need to include this 50% of the population, that it's about the human rights to participate, but it's about also being more effective to address the global challenges we have.
All right, I think we have about 2 minutes more for you, Philippe. So I want to ask a question for you. Is that, when you look at the youth globally, about 90% of them are from developing nations. Now, the summit is supposed to address the needs of this particular population that represents the distinct proportion of the future gen. So how is it going to help, with the representation of the distinct proportion of the future generations? Quickly.
So, Abina, let me at least dissent a little bit. I think that the summit is not only about young people. The summit is about global governance, is about the future of multilateralism. So this involves everyone. There's a necessity of really put the focus on young people and also put the focus on future generations, because also this summit is about, which is not a synonym of young people, Future generations is about taking actions, taking into account what is going to affect the ones that are not already born. And that's the focus of this challenge. You mentioned very clearly 90% of young people live in developing countries. And that's why the UN is so important as a platform, as a multilateral structure. And there are power dynamics. Of course they are. We're very conscious about that. But we all believe, and I think that all the 193 countries that are part of this platform still believes in the uniqueness and the capacity of this platform. We have challenges. We need to address this. At the end, the commitments will come from governments. That's also the power of the UN. You know, the UN is not an international NGO. The UN is an intergovernmental platform where governments meet. And that's the uniqueness and the power. But in order to be more effective, more inclusive also, we need to reshape the way we're engaging with citizenship and especially with young people.
All right, thank you. Abby, do you have any submissions? If you do, the floor is yours for the next 4 minutes.
Well, thank you. So I agree with a lot of what Felipe just said, but I will also add, I think one thing to remember as we're talking about engaging youth and talking about engaging youth in the now, right, for Summit of the Future, is that we have to keep, we have to be willing as government institutions, as international organizations, as civil society, to keep evolving about how we're incorporating those youth voices because of how quickly technology continues to change, how young people are engaging. I know last year we did an event right before High Level Week where it was really around civic engagement and having these voices heard. And what one of the things I think it's like really important to remember here is that young people are being heard in a way right now or around the world that they've never been before because of the way technology works, right? So they're able to use their voices, whether it's in social media platforms or even access to government officials, and that has changed and shifted, I think, in a better way over the last few years. But the reality is, they're being heard. It's just our government's listening, right? Our institutions listening. And I think, again, whether you're in civil society or you're in these government institutions, it's really important that we're building those strong relations to actually be able to have those young people really listen to versus just be heard, if that makes sense. Leaders know that young people are using their voices, right? Like I said, but at the same time, what are they doing about it? And that's really where we have to continue to do that work. That's why I was really excited about Summit for the Future. I do think there is more to be done. There always is in these spaces. But again, that's why these relationships are so important. These types of events are important. Global Citizen is important. Being able to have a good relationship with the Assistant Secretary General of Youth is important because we have to keep working together to figure out how do we keep incorporating these voices. One thing I will also add, I was not aware of all of these amazing programs until actually I joined the U.S. State Department. I was even in Congress as I was elected at the age of 29 and served a term. And during that time, I did not know all these amazing youth programs existed, but I do now. And one of the things that we do, we call these Y programs. We have them all over the globe in every single region nearly. One region's about to be announced during UNGA in a few weeks. But one of these Y programs, one of the first ones was called YALI, Young African Leaders Initiative, and then there's YSEALI, Young Southeast Asia Initiative. There's YTLI, our Young Transatlantic Initiative. There's YLI, our Young Leaders of Americas. So the young YPLs, our Young Pacific Leaders Initiative. And all of these Y programs are really focused on actually hearing from young people who are on the ground, talking to them what matters and how can we be better partners in this work, in your growth, and also about how can we be better partners as well about the impact you're making on your community, right? Where there's ripple effects. And I think those are some of the most magic things that can happen in the youth space because young people are extraordinary. They are the ones who are coming up with the best ideas I have heard out there. And if we can continue to empower them, actually put resources behind them, that leadership program, especially even in the civic engagement space, where they're not just thinking about policy, but becoming policymakers, like that is where the magic happens. And it's the stuff that I'm really passionate about. It's the stuff that I hope we can continue to do. And again, I'm just really grateful that organizations like this and also the UN are putting emphasis on this, and it's great to be a partner in that.
Thank you so much. Hila, do you have any responses?
I think three recommendations. Sometimes when we have summit like these, we tend to focus more on the quantity rather than the quality of the summit as well. Sometimes we have these like 10,000 young people attended the summit, like 5,000 people attended. And what happens is like young people keep rushing from one panel to another panel when this is how most summit works. And I think it's really important when we have summits like this, that the quality should be focused more on how the quality of the summits are, whether the discussion we are making, is it meaningful or not? Is all the stakeholders, important stakeholders who needs to be involved in these panels, are they present or not? And the other thing, I think most of the time, most of these summit are very expert centric, because sometimes we have the same expert, we have the same young people who already know about these issues, who already know what's going on, and we keep having the same expert talking to experts. And I think we need to diversify this a little bit more and bring that grassroots people who doesn't know about the UN or these very fancy summit, or doesn't know about like certain resolution, but they are active leaders on the ground, they are indigenous leaders on the ground, they're making a lot of things in their community, focusing on the SDGs without having big, large funding resources. And we need to bring those voices. And I keep saying that bringing grassroots experience, grassroots leaders is really important, because sometimes the realities on the ground does not match what we're saying at the international platform. And the third thing I think we need to focus on is follow-up. Whenever we have these type of summit, follow-up is really important, because a lot of these summits, whatever the outcome of these summits or all the documents that are published or whatever we're doing, it never reaches to the grassroots level. And I think this is really important. I think this is something we need to focus on, because there are a large population of young people who doesn't know what happens after the summit. Okay, we had future of the summit at the UN. Okay, what happens after that? How do we follow it up? How are we transitioning all these resources or getting this into the grassroots level? And I think we need to focus on these three areas a lot, focus more on the quality of these conferences rather than just the quantity of it. We want our voices to be heard. We just don't want to attend these summit as a tokenistic way, but we want to be heard, and bringing those grassroots leaders, those grassroots voices, that's why it's so essential, because the realities on the ground needs to match the reality at the global level. And this is what we need to focus on.
Rightly said, Abhila. Thank you so much for this thought-provoking submission. Now, finally, Rich, let's take your submission for that.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. So, I mean, Michael said, are we meeting the needs for inclusion and pluralism? And the short answer just has to be no, whether it's within the Summit of the Future or how multilateralism is working in general. But I think what is shifting in some places is that we're realizing that inclusion and pluralism and activating, whether it's young people or anyone, citizens, is an essential element and not an optional sort of normative good thing to do. It's an essential way to make global governance more effective. And this, I think, is a really important step in the right direction. And the way I think about multilateralism right now is I think of it as a patchwork quilt globally. Like, there are opportunities in certain countries where a government might come in and they might be able to open things up. And there are other places like it's closing down. Like, speaking frankly, in my country over the last kind of 15 years, it's been closing down. Much harder to have bottom-up effective governance innovation happening, but it's opening up at the moment because of the change in government. And so I think we have to be really tactical in terms of that, recognizing the reality of these certain opportunities. I think the fact we've got the current SG calling for this, we know he's not going to be around forever, not much longer. We need to harness this opportunity. And as Professor Jagannath said, we do need to really see this as the start of a moment of getting really, really serious about how to do this. And I think this point that that Heels mentioned about grassroots becoming a buzzword. A lot of this stuff is easy to say and hard to do. And it was great to hear Michael's talking about the practical pluralism monitor. What we need to get really clear around what are the technical, mechanical ways we can do this. And finishing on one kind of positive note, I don't know if anyone saw the UN Foundation report on the value of climate cooperation. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend you checking it out, because what they spoke about was this difference between kind of formal multilateralism and informal multilateralism over the last kind of 50 years in the climate space. And what they illustrated within that report is how in this informal multilateralism space, the NGOs, CSOs cooperating, the science cooperation, has actually actually led to a reduction, for example, in deaths around COVID, they estimate, of 3 times more people would have died if it wasn't for that informal multilateralism. And I think our job now in forums like this is the work that we're doing together. We need to actually turn what we're doing together that we know already works, we've heard about today, into this formal version of a new version of multilateral, and not get too worried about trying to get stuck in the old models. I think the way we're going to really reboot the UN multilateral system is not by spending too long rewiring the internal system of the existing bureaucracies, but actually creating new bureaucracies, building their profile, and actually creating competition with them, which over time can actually be used to kind of integrate within the current formal multilateral system.
All right. Thank you so much, Rich. Now we have a very final question for our key speakers. And, the chapter 4 of the UN Summit of the Future will focus on youth and future generations, particularly Action 39 and 40 speaks of strengthening meaningful youth participation at the national and international level. Now, youth movements, however, often face credibility and financial obstacles, exactly as how Hila was sharing an example of how sometimes the grassroots organizers need to, work hours before they're able to get as little as internet connectivity to be able to have these meetings. Now, the question is, what is your advice to the young generation, especially those who want to advocate for issues effectively? How can this be achieved at the national as well as the international level? Let me start with you, Abby.
Thank you. I will say this. Oftentimes, right, especially young people all over the globe in so many different circumstances are not getting as many opportunities as some young people, whether it's different countries or young people with different resources. And if you are one of those young people, again, like kind of similar to what I was talking about, where I grew up with more cows than people and was first gen college, right? Sometimes there weren't a lot of opportunities, and when you got one or when you saw there might be a possibility, you just have to take it, and you've got to believe, and you've got to try, and you've got to not give up, because we need you. It also means, though, that government institutions and, again, civil society partners, we have to do a better job of being more proactive, of reaching out to you as well. We have to find you. We have to be able to, again, help you lift up those voices. But anytime you see those opportunities, you take them, whether it's something you think you, might be able to get, if it's an application process, a fellowship, something like that. Try it anyway, and don't doubt yourself. We need you in these spaces. The other thing I will say is, when you do get in those rooms, right, where you have these lawmakers or you have these secretary generals in front of you, right? I really encourage you, and I know this from my time in Congress and also the State House, when you're talking about policy and somebody would come to talk to me, it was way less about the numbers for me than it was about the stories of the people that were there and their why, right? And so if you can tell your story, you can talk about your why, that is the stuff that sticks with the people who sometimes are in those positions to make those changes. And please don't think that your story doesn't matter, because it does. And I can tell you again from experience, that's the stuff that changed me as a public servant when I would hear those stories. And once you hear them, if you're a good public servant, you can't stop till you do something about it. And so please believe in your power and keep going. But again, we all need to do more to make sure those spaces are created and that we're able to uplift you as well.
Absolutely. Felipe.
Avina, I have 2 minutes, no?
Yes, you have 2 minutes for this.
Can I break protocol and I can use one, and I will want to give 1 minute to Nardos, because I think she's a young person in this room, and
Absolutely.
I would like to hear from her. On my side, this conversation is full, not here in this panel, around is full of change makers. So I don't want to give advice to them, because I really feel that I should know much more details about what the challenges they are currently facing. But maybe my reflection, and it's something that works for me, is that every action counts, and it's very important to start local and to think global, but the biggest advancements come through solving everyday challenges that people encounter, and that actions are the ones that really are change making. So that's my reflection about it. And now, Narda, you have the floor. Nardos.
Thank you so much. And just to add to that, I think everything has been covered that I wanted to say, but I agree that in terms of recommendations on how to amplify meaningful youth participation moving forward as we work towards the summit, but also beyond, is that there's also the need to promote inclusive platforms, of course, encourage and facilitate partnerships, leverage digital platforms, invest in our capacity building activities, engage and make sure that the youth are engaged and are fairly represented in these discussions as we shape policies that are directed towards their future. Thank you.
All right. Rich?
Yeah, I think, building on what Nada's just said, I think we need this. So many of the most powerful advocates and builders of new institutions are the young people. Frankly, I feel often I wonder if people like me need to step back. In my team, I think some of the powerful are the people who are much younger than me. And what I notice is as they get older, as we all get older, we end up fitting into the bureaucracies that are actually part of the problem. So I would really make it clear, and I don't want to give advice because you're right, Felipe, but I notice even in myself, as I have got older, I've become more institutionalized. And as I got more institutionalized, I've become less effective in terms of being the change we all really need. So I was just trying to, if you've got a sense of how things need to change, just honor it and absolutely nourish yourself against the inevitable pushback you're going to come. Because older people like me are going to tell you that you're wrong. And it's actually us that need to step back.
Quite insightful. Hila?
I think my advice would be to work on a lot of adaptability and flexibility when it comes to activism and working in this field, because working in a conflict zone, sometimes we do get this rush like, oh, we need to speak up, we need to work, but there is a lot of safety and security concern for a lot of young people, and sometimes we're using every opportunity puts them into the risk as well, especially not having digital safety when you are speaking the truth. And there's something we need to highlight as well, where there are a lot of young people who are working towards these changes, but they are struggling a lot in terms of like accessing these resources. And I think having a mental check is also really important, because we're working on very heavy issues, the social changes we're all constantly bombarded with, like climate crisis, with conflict and war, and then managing our daily life. It's really hard to manage all of them. I think it's really important to focus on mental health as well when we talk about working on these issues, and it's something that we don't focus a lot, and not a lot, and a lot of young people do suffer from intergenerational trauma as well. And I think that's something we need to highlight when we're working on peace building or any activities that involves SDGs as well. And I think these are really important. Adaptability and flexibility when it comes to working on these issues would be my recommendation to a lot of young people.
Exciting. Now, as we conclude our discussion, which I must say has been thought-provoking, has opened different perspectives to these conversations. I know it would be taking to another level. It will not be taken lightly. We all had great submissions, but the UN Summit of the Future, whose future and who shapes it, let's us remember that the future is not a distant horizon, but it is a reflection of the decisions that we all make today. It belongs to all of us, and it is our collective responsibility to ensure that every voice is heard, every perspective is valued, every action is aligned, and it is shared with vision of just, equitable, as well as sustainable world. Now, the future we shape today will define the legacy we leave for generations that are unborn. So let's keep on committing to shaping it with intention. Let's keep on committing to shaping it with inclusivity and courage, and let us not don't give up the hope that comes with it. My name is Abna Soren once again, and I must say it's been an exciting time moderating this panel. And until next year, it's a goodbye for now.
Thank you, Abena, and thank you to everyone who have tuning in. Ladies and gentlemen, our last session of the day will be next in line. The Bridgetown Initiative Fireside Conversation with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade of Barbados, the Honorable Carrie Simmons. The session will begin in a few minutes, so please stay tuned.